To describe that feeling that I had upon waking, I suppose I had it the first morning there in the Durant, and the next morning when I was at home. Now, I can't be positively sure of it, because it seems to me that I didn't have trouble falling asleep, but maybe I did. At any rate, I think I was able to sleep 8 hours, and I can't really be sure that I had that feeling the next day when I woke up, but I rather think I did, and it was a feeling I know I had at some time during that period in my life. As I said on the reverse side of this tape, it was centered at the pit of my stomach. I don't know if it was there immediately when I first came into consciousness, or rather some thought about him, that he was gone, crossed my mind first. It seems to me that perhaps the thought entered my mind, well, maybe had never left my mind really, and maybe it was there before I was awake, conscious, aware, so that my first thoughts, my first awareness as I woke up was to become aware of that feeling in the pit of my stomach. Perhaps I didn't realize what was wrong as I started to wake up, and as I came into awareness, I became more and more aware of the feeling. I don't know if I laid there and tried to go back to sleep, or if I got up because that feeling was so gnawing, so impossible to ignore, so impossible to stand. And yet at that stage of my life, it seemed I was bothered by these emotional feelings. I haven't described yet about college. One example would be LSB, that huge dungeon-like building. It was a dreary place, and it bothered me, and yet all the aura of a college student, a more romantic concept, was what I wanted. And I tried to hide from myself the dreariness of that building. Oh, of course I talked about it, yes, but still I didn't want to let it really get me down. Not just the joking about it and all, but there was something else that was much more emotional. A person can be around some place that is very dreary, and they'll say, oh, isn't this a dreary place? And yet maybe it doesn't bring the emotional feeling with it. Well, we could joke about the dreary place, but it was that emotional feeling that I didn't really want to admit. And so always I was trying to ignore it. Well, that wasn't a terribly stunting sort of emotion, or particularly strong, so that it completely enveloped me. This that I felt, this tension in the stomach, and the feeling I had when controllably or uncontrollably the thought entered my mind that he was gone, and the thought of him going down that hill into another world. This was a very strong emotion, a very strong feeling, overpowering almost. But still in those days it was my way, you might say my belief. Still, I don't think it is really in the realm of a belief. It was more the way I reacted. I reacted in such a way that I would try to ignore these depressing, loose-end feelings. Try not to let them be conscious, in other words. Not that they were so consciously suppressed as the thoughts about the questions. Why had he done this, and how could he when before he'd said something that would seem as though he couldn't have possibly said this other later? No, it was not conscious in that sense. It was more as though I feared these feelings, and so I tried not to admit them, recognize them. And yet, of course, I did recognize them, just as I had when I crossed the street that time in Berkeley in November, I guess it was, after working at the stamp store. They were feelings of that nature, only after this big trauma it was so much stronger, so much more overpowering. Maybe better than saying that I tried not to admit them to consciousness, to myself, would be this feeling that although I recognized them, maybe I had no power to do other than admit them, or maybe they were there, growing increasingly into my consciousness, and when I felt this feeling, this mood, you might say, this something wrong, something unpleasant, uncomfortable coming into my awareness, I naturally had to know it was there, recognize it, and I thought about it and realized what it was from, and maybe a thought accompanied it, or a mental picture, such as the picture of him going down the street there as he left the Durant. And this wasn't called up in way of explanation, the picture, and maybe the picture came first and then the feeling. Maybe that's how it all started. However, when I first woke up, it seems to me it was more the feeling was there first, and yet possibly I had the thought and then the feeling came. And so you see, it was all conscious in this respect, but it was more a running away. I think that would better describe it. You couldn't say I didn't admit it because I was that frank with myself, but I would go on trying to do something to get away from it. Of course, even before the trauma, I had done this. Remember my telling about we girls planning up something and how I would try to act as though I were enjoying it, and it wasn't just for them, it was for myself. I wanted to believe I was having a good time, and so I'd keep forcing myself, trying to tell myself what fun I was having. And all the time, that mood was there. Oh, I don't mean always, on all the occasions, because we did have some fun, of course. But so often, now and then, it would be there, and I'd go on trying to have a good time and trying to win over. So when the mood came on me, usually I would try to get away from it, and you could say that I tried to ignore it. Although sometimes I first had to admit that it was there so that I could know what I was trying to ignore. And sometimes when I first felt it coming on, I guess you might say, even that I would try not to admit it until finally I had to admit it. I don't know how much school was left, mainly because I can't pinpoint the date of our last meeting. Mrs. Monroe had planned a recital. It seems to me she explained that I wouldn't be in it because, well, I'd started out promisingly. I hadn't shown sufficient progress. But you will remember that the thing I really cared about wasn't a career or voice at all, really. It was John. And it seems to me that the recital came after John and I had had our last meeting. I recall going to the recital, and it seems to me that I felt depressed or inadequate. And so it leads me to think that maybe the recital was after our last meeting, because I don't think this feeling of inadequacy was completely due to not being in the recital and feeling therefore insufficient. I think it was due also to not being in the recital and not being able to get the man that I loved either. So although at this time in my life I may not have told myself, oh, you're so inadequate, so ineffectual, nonetheless the insecurities due to these failures were felt, I am sure. I am so sure that we had gone up to Forest Hill on a Sunday, and the following Monday I had been sick, and it seems to me that it was about the next day or so, although in a way it seems I would have been sick longer than one day. But anyway, shortly after being sick I had gone down to Berkeley, and all that little episode followed in sequence: Forest Hill, sickness, and then Berkeley. So the recital must have been after the big blow-up. Surely we couldn't have gone to Forest Hill on Mother's Day, because I don't see how I would have had time to have completed my Mother's Day card, handmade. I think I'd been working on it before, days before. Of course, in a way, I don't see how I could have done that either because of the play, but maybe I did during the play. I mean, the days of the play. And it seems to me that I completed it on Mother's Day and gave it to Mama then. Well, like I say, the sequence is hard to pin down. But the more I think about it, it seems that the recital did come after the big blow-up. It seems, as I said, that I had met Ron Wiles at the cast party after the Boer. So therefore, of course, I wouldn't have dated him before. It seems phenomenal that I could have started dating him, even if the blow-up was on the 22nd of May, and I dated him the following weekend, the 25th. It seems phenomenal that he would have gotten so serious over me in such a short time, especially considering how I felt about him. I remember we went to some parties of some friends of his, and I did little else but sit unanimated, talking of course, but I don't think I was outgoing, because again it was like being with someone you didn't want to be with, when all the time your mind and your heart was somewhere else, somewhere that it was completely futile for you to think of being. And later, when I began to be able to take more of an interest in people, well, out with someone I wasn't romantically interested in, I remember the man at whose house so many of the parties were held, having had a few drinks and having said, you know, when I first met you, I didn't like you, but now I think you're tops. Or was it great, or some indication that he felt a strong bond. He was a married man, and I don't think he meant it romantically at all. It was a very serious sort, and I think this is where he felt the bond, talking through discussions, sort of an intellectual, mental meeting. I'd ask him why he hadn't liked me at first, and he'd said he thought I was trying too hard. And that was so ironical, although I didn't tell him. But but evidently he thought I was trying to create some sort of a impression by my look, which resulted from my sullen feeling. Maybe the look hadn't looked sullen, but like someone who was trying to create an impression. If I were trying too hard at anything, it was simply trying to go through the social life that it seemed young people, normal young people, did, and manage somehow to have some sort of life in spite of the deep hurt and loss I had undergone. But of course the man thought I was trying to create an impression of mystery or some sort of a femme fatale, evidently. I don't know exactly when the thought of writing it all down, making a book out of the past, which I suppose would have ended at the trauma of spring of '57. Maybe I had thought of writing it all down immediately after getting out of college. Or maybe while I was in college I thought of writing it as soon as I got out. Yes, I think I did. And then it would have been a love story that just couldn't have been. And then in the summer it began to seem as though it would have been a love story that was impossible to end this way, as indicated in some of the notes and attempts at letters, which I didn't mail often, that I wrote in 1957, the early part, before finding him again. And now, after the trauma, it was a story of a heartless man, a cruel man. And it was a story of irony and a story of a woman who loved and lost. I may have had some titles in mind for the other two phases. I'm sure I did think about writing it during college because I also had in mind to write down Jay's story. After the upset of the summer, I don't know what the title was going to be, and maybe I had no title during college, when it would have been a happier book, had it ended as I thought it would during college. Suppose after the summer was over, it was during the period when he had just quit writing. Remember when I wrote in the diary, the blue book? How could it end in such a way? No word from him. How could it end like that? I don't know what the title would be then. And still there was some room for understanding, and so it might have been somewhat a beautiful love story, but with bitter tinges. I suppose I may as well mention that possibly after starting dramatic training, after being at loose ends, starting the training at Sac State in February, maybe during that interval, of course I remember that I had been interested in and had seen many movies and plays ever since college was out in '56, so it may even have been during the summer itself. I'd seen plays, beginning to understand literature and plays, and I thought of making a movie. I mean, outlining it, writing how it could be done, and probably, if it ever got to be accepted, to help produce it. And it would be the story of two people in love, and how a church came between them. And it would have been impressionistic. The people would have been represented by people, but there would have been casts of color put over the lenses, maybe, that would have made the film on the screen, the whole thing with a cast of some color over it. And they would have been colors that would have suggested joy or sadness or trauma, frustration, depression. There would have been dashes of color, splotches as it were, sort of like dandelion heads after they've gone to seed. And maybe some of them would have been flickered on. Photography would have been such that they would have been put in for maybe a couple of frames, then left out and put in again. And there would be periods of the whole impression would be one of joy, love, security, eternalness. And then the priest would come, and all of a sudden things would get black and depressing and upsetting. And the idea would have been to create in the audience, through visual means, something of the mood, of the feeling, the emotion, the cast, so that they could understand how I felt, how people feel sometimes, so that they would care. I hadn't seen it done that I recall. Well, it might even possibly have been after the trauma, and yet the movie itself wasn't to be bitter. And as I recall, if there was a culprit in it, it would have been the church or the priest, and not John. Of course, the movie wouldn't have been about us directly. The idea was taken from what had happened to me, my experience. It was to be about a boy and girl of different religions. And at the time I was thinking of it, I don't know if it really had a moral. It seems funny that I could have painted the church as such a disturbing force, when all the time I was coming more and more to feel the Catholic Church might be right. Of course, there is the possibility that this idea for a movie, was in my mind during the summer, before I had progressed that far toward accepting the Catholic Church. Well, anyway, the book titles came to be The Disenchanted and others. In a way, I think maybe I didn't think of the titles so much all at once. Maybe I thought of some in the weeks or days that followed the trauma. I don't know how I was going to handle it when I got up to spring of '57, because, as I mentioned, there were parts of that traumatic episode that I could not think about. Well, maybe that impressionistic movie I was thinking of was indeed during the summer, the earlier part of the summer of '56, before I came to acknowledge the Catholics might be right, toward fall of '56. And in spite of the hostility I felt toward John, feeling that he had not done what he should have done and what he might have done, that he had been cruel, in fact, I guess I didn't blame that on his religion, and I don't think I changed my mind about his religion as a result of the blow-up we had had. I still felt Catholic husbands were very desirable, as I had come more and more to think during that summer of '56. If you stay right with a Catholic husband and follow him everywhere, go everywhere with him, don't leave him for weeks by himself, he would be far superior and more desirable to have for a husband from the angle of being true and moral than other men. And after all, hadn't John been far more virtuous than the other boys I met after college? The Jack who was always drinking and telling homosexual jokes. John hadn't told dirty jokes at all, I would remember. And so in spite of feeling that he hadn't done the right thing in spring of '57, I still felt Catholic husbands were desirable to the others. And I guess a part of that, she must be a wonderful girl to be loved by you. And the you, of course, was so good and ideal that I had simply missed out. Maybe through poor timing, maybe through some inferiority of my own. But it didn't make the you, him, John, any less desirable. So it seems that I had two contradictory views of him, ambivalent feelings toward him, and the fact that I felt he had been unfair, cold, cruel, didn't abolish these other thoughts from my mind, which placed him in a favorable light. Remember how I'd said, after finding out that he loved her, and asking him what if I had married him during college? And he'd said, I wouldn't have met her. And I'd said, well, what kind of security was there in that? And I had meant, what kind of security was there in being loved by someone simply because he didn't know anything else, didn't know someone better? Well, according to that, it sounded as though I considered myself lucky, or that I should consider myself lucky, that I hadn't married him. But I found out, I don't know how soon, in spite of my statement that night after coming home from Berkeley, that it was lucky that I found out what kind of a person he was, and saying or implying that someone so untrue wasn't worth having, wasting one's time on. And in spite of this, and in spite of that statement about no security in that, I found I was not glad. I was not glad that the timing had been all wrong and I had lost out, because I seemed to take that other attitude, that he was really a very desirable husband material, and I had lost it because of the timing, or because of some inadequacy in myself, or simply because, no matter what my qualifications, she was more qualified. One thing that I did not want to know, to hear, to admit, to find was true, was that it wasn't the religion, and it wasn't even the interests. And yet, maybe he tried, and it seems he did, try to make it seem as though it was, tried not to tell me, to admit that religion and interests weren't the real issues. Somehow I think there on the entranceway of the Durant, when finally all he could say was it isn't right, after I had conceded about religion and interests, or indicated that I might, possibly there it even hit me more than when I'd asked him about his loving her and wanting her when we had been in a circle in the car. I think even when I'd questioned him, I was hoping there at the entranceway that I wouldn't know, that somehow, at least, I would go away with the feeling that it had been the religion, not that he didn't love me or loved her, someone else, more really, or at least hoping to convince myself that religion was the real issue, and that had it not been for that, at least he might have loved me more. But you see, I lost that. I think even there I didn't want to know, and I knew I didn't want to know, and yet I had kept questioning him to a showdown until he hadn't said it. I've already told you of the point in the conversation where I knew. I was convinced. Maybe somewhere even that evening I had sobbingly said, don't take that from me, John. Please don't take that from me. And yet, of course, there was no way to convince me that had it not been for the religion or the interests, that he would have loved me more, because I took the religion and the interests away. And afterward, I think I thought of that as being cruel too, that he would take even that from me. And yet it was myself who forced it to a showdown. I had to know the truth even though I didn't want to, really. I don't know when in class or where it was. Maybe it was something I'd known before. But it was like, I think, the play of Shakespeare's Midsummer's Night Dream, where someone pleads, please don't take my illusions from me. Although you know they're not true, and maybe I know they're not true, please don't tell me. They are all I have. Well, anyway, I guess that's how I felt, even as I was insisting upon the truth, forcing the issue. And even afterward, I came to see it in him as a cruel thing that he would let me see the truth. And yet what else could he have done? And then there was that aspect about, instead of being thankful, glad that I found him out for the coolness with which he handled the situation, that last meeting, how he had deceived me the time before, and how he refused to even give me another hour of his time the next day after the trauma, and many, many more things that seemed cruel. Even his becoming playful, my having to drag the truth out of him, and my having to tell him that I wasn't a plaything, a toy for his enjoyment. But it was necessary to tell him that instead of feeling glad that I'd found him out and seen this side of him, I was not, because of the terrific impact on my emotions and beliefs and ideals. It reminded me of something that I saw 3 or more years later in a little Orphan Annie column. The little saying that usually comes before the strip itself. Suddenly Annie sees the light, but, and here's the quote, "'Twas a light that made darkness itself appear a thing of comfort." And so it seemed that all that long summer, and even after that summer, winter, and the beginning of spring, the terrible anxiety of the summer, and the still rising of anxiety from time to time, perhaps just as intense. My memory is not too good there. In spite of all that, to know the way I found out, the manner in which I found out, made the darkness, the not knowing, seem better. Here is something I wrote, evidently soon after the traumatic meeting. A month ago I made a decision. I would see him again. I worked out amazingly easy. It was a big decision to make. I had felt fate would step in some way and kept a glimmer of faith in a miracle. Somehow he would come to me. Something was keeping us apart. It was not meant to be, or at least at that time, but I believed in him. I defied fate. I found him. Now, in place of love, I have bitterness. In place of something to live up to, something to try to look coldly on. In place of hating him for his thoughtlessness, I find fault and worthlessness in myself. The sense of worth, security of having had something wonderful, been valued by someone wonderful, is gone. In its place is the feeling of being so insignificant that he couldn't bother himself to tell me the truth. He had so little respect for me, he did not choose to be truthful. I deserved no explanation. Things that were so important to me, that I believed in so deeply, the things he said, the feelings he confessed to have, were not important enough to him that one should bother thinking of them. Here, I suppose, what I was driving at was that they weren't worth his being true to, or somehow reconciling in his mind and realizing that he should tell me of any change he had in them. I go on. Yes, it was a bitter shock, a poor trade, this wonderful faith for this terrible truth. Perhaps this was punishment for having acted against fate. Yet I think it is rather the reward. 6 months of my life were wasted because he would not tell me the truth when I sincerely and in faith requested it. 1/2 of a year. I realize now that I could not have loved anyone else here because I still believed in him and was by nature true. I would have gone on for years, having faith that if I were good enough, prayed enough, somehow, someday he would return in truth. What a vain hope, to live for something that would never be, to believe in something, someone, in reality so different from one's trust. Reading this over now, I see I might temper what I have said just before on the tape, or at least it would seem I should, because I said maybe it was a reward for having acted, not just let fate pull me along. The reward was to find out and not waste any more of my time believing in him. But remember, this was written one time. True, it probably was after having thought it over a bit, quite a bit, of course. I don't know how soon it was after the trauma, whether I had thought it over for days or what, and maybe I just came to this conclusion as I reached this point in this writing. Maybe after the words, maybe it was punishment. Maybe then the thought hit me that maybe it was a reward. At any rate, I think it was a time in my life when I felt one way one minute and one way the next. I don't think that I felt the light which made darkness a comfort was punishment for acting against fate. I think I thought of it more not in terms of punishment or reward, but I realized that no matter how desirable, how important it was to face reality, it was painful, the revelation that I had found out about. So you might say that even if I accepted it as a reward, having found out, I realized that the reward, if you call it that, was painful. Of course, in one case we're talking about finding out about his cruelness, his coldness, deceit. And in the other case, the light was the truth, and the truth was that it wasn't the religion. It was that for some reason he loved her and not me. So in a way you might say that they're different issues. But of course there's no getting away from the fact that it does seem contradictory, at least at first glance, if not even after analyzing it somewhat. Well, I guess I still, although I probably didn't think it often, had to admit that I was still in love with him. After all, I'd said I would always love him. It wasn't because I was trying to live up to what I had said, but simply because it was a fact. I don't know when I saw this little clipping. It was about a sign in front of a shoe shop with a picture of a beautiful girl displaying various styles of heels, and she says, "I'm in love with America's #1 heel." Underneath it, someone had written, "Too bad, sister, I married him." Well, I wasn't married to John, but I was in love with him. And this item sort of illustrates how I felt an identification with that statement. I'm in love with America's #1 heel. Of course, there was humor in this. It wasn't just seeing the humorous side of a bad situation which had arisen in spring of '57. Remember that John and I had joked back and forth about some way that he had turned it into my saying that he was a heel. Well, there had been some sadness that made me mention that. I guess it was indirectly. It had been a point of humor between us during college days. Toward the end of school, we had to turn in a term paper. I remember Jack Bruford came over sometimes while I was writing it. I was writing about Helen Hayes, and her daughter had died young, a young lady. There were several things that must have had meaning for me during that time. Evidently, I singled out this page of notes as something more than just a term paper. It tells how Helen Hayes felt Mary's death cruel and senseless, that this was a self-destructive mood for an artist because they need belief that life holds some beauty and meaning. You can't create if you have none in you. I suppose I felt what had happened to me was cruel and senseless. Another thing that I probably identified with was her statement of her search for God. She read St. Thomas Aquina and about Gandhi, the Bible, and if after these I have written failed. Evidently she failed in her search and failed to find comfort. Then she mentioned that she took no engagements, professional or social. And finally she concludes that God is to be found in the human heart, not books. Then I had a note where she seemed to decide that, I suppose it was problems, afflict the celebrated. Says, "None is privileged. In my eyes, all are equal." And then evidently where she was quoting from Mrs. Isaac France, how much better it is to have existed, even though ended. I suppose that's an incomplete part of a quote. And I don't know if this was Helen Hayes or the other lady says, that you must go on with more love because of knowledge of suffering of others. You should not let yourself, I guess, dry up and go to waste. I don't know if I agreed with her that God would be found in human hearts and not books. I still had quite a respect for books, and that would seem to be little books. Maybe I took that statement about existing, better to have existed, though ended, to mean that it was better that I had had something that I had found beauty in, the relationship between John and I. Or early it was a tender love story. And maybe I took to heart also that statement that you should not let yourself dry up and go to waste. I don't know if this was the period when the dreams started. They were very distressing, and I'll mention at least one that I can recall later. But they may have started soon after the trauma, maybe even during school. I don't know when I noticed about the poppies. I don't think they were up yet. But that didn't matter because before, when things were so beautiful and wonderful, I was so happy. I had gone out and cared for them, watered them, watched excitedly, and now what a strange, different mood I was in. How heavy was my heart. There was still the song Dark Moon, and yet it really didn't help. It turned out that that song, which was so pretty, didn't seem to be of much comfort. I don't know if I went out to look at the poppies at all. Probably days went by and I didn't water them, so of course they didn't grow, and maybe they never even saw the sunshine. I think a few had started to grow, come to think of it, before. But all the joy of beautiful flowers and how interested I'd been in them seemed gone, to be of no comfort. Maybe it made me feel even more pathetic to go out and think of them. And when I look back, it seems pathetic. Something I'd planted and cared for so carefully, and how empty it all seemed. Like the flower-strewn room the Madame Butterfly had prepared for great joy and which became only ironical. Beauty surrounding such terrible sadness and such a bitter blow. Back at school, out on the golf course, where once I had, maybe only a day or so before, trying to contain my joy when speaking of him. My boyfriend was a coach. Now I found myself, as Lorna helped me with my golf drive and mentioned how her boyfriend had taught her how to golf, I mentioned sadly, although of course trying to hide my sadness, trying to seem casual about it, unemotional, just factual, mentioned, "Oh, you'd think I'd do better at this. My ex-boyfriend was a golf coach." And maybe I added that he also was a track coach at a junior college. And maybe I named it. But I wasn't unemotional, really, deep down. I didn't know I'd feel about it, see it the way I did after having said it. I felt again that what a pathetic creature I was. And I didn't want to be pathetic. I wanted to be proud and attractive and desirable like the other girls, talking about my boyfriend. And now all I could do was talk about my ex-boyfriend, and how ironical it was to the great joy and expectations I'd had only a week or days before. I've already mentioned how, when I first met Don, I allied myself with him, as though against John, and nothing came of it, and in fact I felt that Don became distant and acted overly aloof. And then I found John again, and whereas before I'd thought, well, it doesn't matter about John, that day that I came home and saw the trees in the puddle and all. And when I found John, I had a similar feeling as against Don. Of course, it wasn't nearly as strong or anything. Well, anyway, here I was now, unable to ally myself with either one of them. No Don, no John. No one to feel romantically interested in. Of course, the blow was so great that I probably didn't even think of it at the time. And of course, it was probably a good thing that nothing had come of the relationship with Don, had it worked out with John. It would have been sort of a comfort to have someone who was interesting at least, even though nothing had come of it so far. But there wasn't even that, although John did become more friendly toward the end of the semester, as I recall. Still, I can't really be sure. Maybe he had even stopped writing home, having stayed down often, I don't know. And of course I had quit staying down. By the time the play was over, I'm sure I did. Well, anyway, I came home from that trauma, and remember I had been sick before I went down. And I was still on that diet, high protein, lots of custard and different things. And I found that I didn't have a re-interest in food. It seemed tasteless. I was despondent. Of course, I could have eaten and eaten and eaten at a time like this, maybe attempting to find something flavorful about food. But I wasn't enjoying it, so I said, why eat? I had always felt a bit overweight, although everyone told me I wasn't. And I began to lose weight. And I kept losing and kept losing and kept losing. One thing that would seem to point up that this trauma must have been before the 22nd of May was because it seems I remember so many things happened between the trauma and the end of school. Remember, I at least started going out with Ron, and we played tennis one day at school. And it seems to me that afterward I had time to notice Don on campus. Of course, maybe I had seen him when I first started school and was looking around to see if there'd be anyone interesting. And I decided that Don was one of the best-looking boys on campus. And I think that I thought to myself, I'd like to have him ask me out. And in order to have that thought, I'm sure it must have been after the trauma, and there seems that there must have been more than 2 weeks of school left, because I think it took me a while to get over that terrific shock. I don't mean to start going out again, because it was an emotional shock, and it wouldn't be unusual for such an emotional shock to set someone rapidly, frantically dating and going places simply because they don't want to admit or let the other thoughts into their mind. So they begin on a frenzy of activity. And also I remember that I lost so much weight, and it doesn't seem possible that I could have lost it in 2 weeks. I remember the kids in class saying that I was getting so thin, and one of the kids in class said, "Don't lose any more weight. You're so thin now that if a good wind came along, it would blow you away." I had received a terrible emotional shock, and it left me not knowing which way to turn, not knowing who I was in a way, what I was capable of, what my assets and liabilities were. I suppose always there is the feeling that I must be inferior because she is so much better than I am. The feeling that a girl has when she had the man first, and someone else can take him away from her. She seems to find, as I mentioned in my note that I read to the tape, she finds fault with herself. And yet I don't think I really wanted to admit this very much. I mean, I think I tried not to think about it. I tried to cling to some romantic idea of myself, or you might say, tried to find some new romantic channel to pursue. So I would be off on something, trying by action at least to keep myself interested and excited. And yet I knew that I was running. There was the day, I don't know if it was while school was still on or during the summer, when I looked out and saw the blue jays again. There were 2 of them, but now it wasn't John and I. Possibly there had only been one blue jay before, and I had thought of it as John, the provider, the homemaker. But I think there were 2 of them. I'm sure I'd seen 1 or 2 of them before. And anyway, when I saw these that morning, talking to each other, so busy and interested in what they were doing, as blue jays are, it was John and his redhead. And instead of being able to identify with them, I watched as an outsider, hurt because I could never share in it. This wonderful interest, absorbing, consuming world they were in that I could never be in. Even when I had started classes at State, I found it hard to keep my mind on the class. Dramatics class and arty people seemed to just force me back more toward John, toward memories of him. There was one song that I would always play. It was a Chopin piece, piano, and I would play it, and it had a sadness, a melancholy, and it seemed to say, "This song you will play, and no matter how long you would play it into eternity, you will never see him again." And it was a song of sadness. And after the trauma, because it had that sadness even before, but I defied it, I had seen him again. And after the trauma, with that mood so near the surface, I would go on playing the song, trying to tell myself it was all nonsense. Things weren't any different when I played the song than they were if I didn't play it. And still it was so haunting. It was terribly uncomfortable and unnerving to play it. I think in the early days even of school, things had come to such a pitch with me. I was so upset and couldn't get my mind off John. I guess that was one of my reasons for starting school. Probably the main reason, although I could find others as excuses. And I remember the one class, I think I had only one, where I could forget for any length of time. I would get so excited and involved in the work itself that I would find myself laughing and interested. And even if it was serious and not funny work at all, I was still so keenly interested. It was exciting, and that was radio recording. It was a relief to have that part of the day. And I don't know if this being bothered, almost hounded, haunted, obsessed by thoughts of John during class was terribly much greater after the trauma. It seemed that I was empty, and there was nothing to go on with, to create with in my classes. And being there just pointed it out more. Golf class. I had lost him, so he had tried to implicate because I hadn't been athletic. How could I get up in dramatics and put my heart into a role when I was so drained of feeling? I'd been so terribly upset that there wasn't much left to draw on for dramatics. But I think still that one class, that radio class, still helped me and relieved me for a little while. The class picnic came. I had lost a lot of weight, you remember. It was very much toward the end of the semester now. I was wearing my lenses, and maybe I just felt more dashing, interesting, better looking, because I had lost weight and because I didn't have to wear the glasses. Of course, there was certainly the fact that now I could see people, whereas before when I'd gone without glasses I couldn't see them very clearly, and it made me feel insecure. Now I had the security of being able to see them and not wearing glasses either. And I seemed quite a whiz. It was new to me to be the belle of the ball. In the first place, Sacramento State dances were different from Cal. There, so many of the dances were just a collection of social misfits, especially as men were concerned. Here, many interesting young men came. In the second place, there was my change in appearance, and maybe this was only like the hair bow that the girl thought she had on her head. And she thought she looked so attractive that she acted in a way that people liked her, and it really wasn't the bow at all because the bow had fallen off. And maybe it was just the way I acted because of the new confidence I had because of my lenses and having lost weight. And then there was the fact that I was at such a keyed up emotional state. I was searching out, grabbing out everywhere, trying new things, trying so hard to be gay and create an exciting atmosphere for myself that I suppose others were caught up in it. It went overboard for me. After all, there was no use sitting in a corner, reminiscing over my real love, missing him as I did during the summer, and thinking that maybe I was all wrong to blame him, and to think that he'd been untrue when maybe he really did love me, but for some reason thought he should, or through misunderstandings had tried to forget me, even though really he didn't want to, because now I had pressed the issue. I had found out there was someone else. I was buzzing around the dance hall floor. I went to talk to a girlfriend of mine who was standing with her partner somewhere in the middle of the crowd of dancers, exchanged excited greetings with her, and her partner was that boy that I had decided was the best looking one on campus. Maybe I had made sort of a goal out of that statement. Instead of being just a mere thought, it was in the form of a goal. I'm going to get him to ask me out. Well, whatever, here he was. I'd observed Gay during college days, and maybe already I was starting to use some of her technique. At any rate, I looked at Don with a very significant look, as though I was most delighted to meet him, and it went over with him. Evidently, he thought he was my Prince Charming, and I'd finally found him. Later on, he and another fellow named Don were actually almost to have a fight over me. I don't know how long after the picnic Ron met me at the gym for a tennis match. He had an extra tennis racket for me. At any rate, I guess it was about after my golf class, maybe a few periods after. Anyway, I put on my white blouse and white shorts. And I remember, well, during high school days, of course, Elaine and I used to go to the swimming pool, and of course there would be boys there. But I had never even gone to the swimming pool with John. And for the years of college, and during the time I was out, I hardly ever went with young people anywhere where I would be in something so abbreviated as a swimsuit. It seems strange to think that someone who had gone through 4 years of college would find wearing gym shorts to a tennis match with a young man so unusual. It wasn't at all that I wanted to impress Ron. On the contrary, he seemed too interested in me. But I was sort of embarrassed. I didn't want to look extraordinary in a bad sense. For one thing, I wondered if my legs were smooth enough. I'd never been in the habit of shaving them above the knee, and maybe I took a remover pad and rubbed it above the calf some. And I remember asking a girl in the gym about it, and I felt rather silly, embarrassed to ask such a question. I didn't really know how to go about it, but she assured me that my legs looked fine. I wondered if I was knock-kneed. I really didn't have any idea how I would compare with other college girls. Well, I don't know if we'd had a match before the picnic, and that was the one I was just talking about, and that we had one after too. At any rate, one time I remember the third Don I had mentioned, the blonde-haired one who was about to have a fight with the Don I'd met at the dance. Or anyway, the blonde one waved at me, and I think he came over and talked once while I was out on the tennis courts. Maybe Ron and I had played before, and I was getting to feel more confident in shorts and a blouse. I suppose it was after school was out that my folks and I went to the civilian club. One of the little favors that they served under the drinks was a napkin, and on it in red ink were drawn some little sayings, and above each one a woman, the same woman. And since her hair was drawn in dark and filled in with the same ink, it was red. And it seems to me that the theme of the whole napkin was, "Men don't get married, be warned," or else, "How the wife treats the husband." Maybe I will find it in some of my souvenirs and can describe it more completely later. Anyway, I guess this was the time that I met Dixie. I don't know if I'd already gone to the El Rancho with Don or not. He asked me when he first met me at the dance how I would like a steak dinner. And at the El Rancho, well, it was fun, a good-looking date. Don wasn't a terrific dancer. I don't remember, but maybe I thought of the time that Thanksgiving, I guess it was, probably of '56, and we'd gone to the El Rancho to eat dinner. My folks and I. We'd played the Poor People of Paris, and how I could almost see him dancing to it, John dancing to it. Maybe that made it sort of hard to be dancing there in that El Rancho with Don, who wasn't nearly the dancer that I remembered John to have been. Well, Dixie wasn't a good dancer either. But I was frantically hoping, searching to find someone. I hadn't been able to kiss Don or Ron. And of course there had been the dates of the summer and winter before, with whom I didn't even care to hold hands. And I hadn't held hands with Ron or Don either. Somewhere I wanted so badly to find someone to care for. Now, years later, I've noticed when women tell of having lost a boyfriend or had their marriage go wrong, one of the most painful things is to see lovers walking hand in hand. So painful because you want to be back with the one you loved. And I guess maybe it's worse if you find it impossible to hold hands or kiss the men you meet during your search to replace what you've lost. Well, I'm sorry to say, there is an episode I must put in. It's very important. And it came before I met Dixie. And yet it was right after school was out. I'm sure it was before I met Dixie. It was the day when Dawn and I were both through with finals and we decided to go to the city. I'd talked with my parents, told them that I wanted to stay down. I'd stay with Jay or Jean, or maybe some of my other friends I may have mentioned. As I recall, my father didn't like the idea of me leaving with a boy and staying down, not returning with him that same evening. But I insisted that what was wrong with it if I stayed at Jay's and Jean's place. That seemed to, well, maybe he didn't really agree, make it not quite so objectionable as if I had broached taking a hotel room. It seems to me that Don was going to stay with some relative of his, or maybe he was simply going to come back home immediately. We went on down and we stopped at Jay and Jean's. Don was a nice-looking boy, and I was glad to introduce him to the girls. It seems to me he was in the car part of the time. I don't know whether that was before or after I saw the girls privately. As you will remember, I mentioned the time Jay danced at the Civilian Club. That fellow asked her out, and she was very excited about it. And they had gone out, and I had stayed home with the folks. So that weekend hadn't turned out to be extra exciting for me. But I knew that Jay was looking for romance, as most girls are, and she thought this boy might be the one. And so, of course, I said nothing against her going out, even though it wouldn't be much fun for me since I had invited her up and thought that she would spend the time stagging with me. But after all, her object and our object in stagging was to meet someone, wasn't it? She stayed out very, very late, and I was very, very worried. And so was my mother. Something happened to the car, but we didn't hear any phone call or anything, so we didn't know what to think. Well, I had in mind to stay at Jay and Jean's. You will remember John's comment, I guess it was either the next to the last or the last meeting in May, when I had mentioned staying at a hotel, and he had sounded abashed, almost as though it were an affront to me, the least of manners, that Jay and Jean hadn't left me their apartment key so that I could have stayed in the apartment while they were gone. He seemed to find it unthinkable that because they were gone, I had no place to stay while I was down there. Well, I didn't think of it that way at all. Of course, in the first place, I wouldn't care to have stayed at their apartment by myself, and I just don't think the thought much entered my head. But now, I had every expectation that I would stay with Jay and Jean that evening, and I think in the back of my mind, whether I admitted it or not, my main hope in getting down there wasn't to go out with Don at all, although I suppose I did want to show him to Jay and Jean and Elaine. And of course it would be fun to go out in the city, but in the back of my mind I hoped to come to Jay and Jean's that night, and I would stay a few blocks above the place where John lived. Maybe it was only 1 or 2 blocks above it. I don't know what I had in mind to say to John, but I had in mind to see him. At times, when I thought of going to see him as soon as school was out, and although that had been the end in my mind, it was all over that day, that night in May. And in spite of all the thoughts I've had and told you about, there was this other thought that kept entering my mind, that I would go see him again. This time I would go up and knock at his door, and maybe I had simply in mind that I wanted to see those trophies and things that I didn't see that time when Mama and I had taken him to dinner, because after all I thought there would be plenty of time to see the trophies. Then I think I had in mind to look to see if my Davy Crockett button was still in the trophy case. Of course, now after school was out, if the pin was gone, I wouldn't know whether it had been there in May or not. And besides, maybe it was still there. And maybe I just wanted to look around his room and see what it was like, see how he lived. Curious. Why should anyone think of something that they can't have, that there's no use hoping for, even when they realize there's no use hoping for it? Why should they care about it? Why should they want to understand it? I don't know. I just did, that's all. Notice this wasn't the dangerous ground for me, mentally and emotionally, that delving into their relationship would have meant. I expected to remain casual about it, and although I don't think I thought of it at the time, it might have been a rehabilitation step because I would have seen John in his new situation, belonging to someone else. I would have seen him as he lived day to day and come to accept it, that he belonged to someone else, that it was reality. As it was sometimes, it all happened that night, and it had been a nightmarish night. And although I'm not sure of this, I rather expect that at times I had said to myself, maybe it's not true, maybe it's all just a terrible dream. But of course, most of the time I knew it was true, and it wasn't this that prompted me to go down. Because, as I say, I had always had a very clear delineation between events that really happened and those of fantasy. And then, too, I think I thought of going down and throwing a grand tantrum, telling him exactly what I thought of him, throwing right into his face all those things he said to me 1 or 2 meetings before, and those that he said at the last. And I would get angry at him, and I would shout and cry, and I would say all the things that I hadn't said that night. Because that night I was too shocked. I was trying to be a good sport about it. And after I got home, I got to thinking, why should I be a good sport when he had been so unfair? And it wasn't with the hope that it would change his mind, because maybe that was why I had held back. Part of the reason, other than the shock and other than my basic philosophy on life, which was that I had to accept it in honor and in dignity. And then I realized what an undignified thing he had made out of it, what lack of dignity he had used in handling the situation. And maybe, in part, it was I didn't want to offend him, because maybe I hoped that he would see the dignity with which I handled it, and it would show him the right way, and he would make things right, hold up his end of it. But he hadn't, and even after, well, maybe I thought if I was very dignified and noble that night, that maybe the next day he would do his share, come by and comfort me in some way. Although I guess nothing could have changed the fact that I had to live that night not knowing. And even after, I don't remember whether I expected it or not. Maybe I did look for a letter. I don't remember it, whether I did or not. And maybe still, I thought, he would write some apology, because I knew he couldn't feel right about the way he had done. To me it was so obviously wrong, cruel, heartless, if only because he hadn't thought in some way. And I guess symbolic of this whole thing was how I had to plead with him to be on the level with me. I had to plead with him to realize that I wasn't a toy, a plaything. But he made no amends at all. And of course, aside from hoping to set example and uphold my side of the situation with dignity, and the hope that by example he too might realize how he was behaving and still make it something, a relationship between man and woman, people, it seemed as though we were more than animals. Maybe I had somehow hoped that withstanding all this suffering and bearing it with dignity, he would admire me and come back. Remember how I had been handling him with kid gloves at one time, as I mentioned, and maybe I never did get off this entirely, even when I found there was no hope. And remember that at times I realized there was no hope, and at times I thought again that there was. Well, anyway, since he had not come back, since he had not even attempted an apology of any sort, I thought maybe he is one of these people that has to be told. And in fact, that is a big point. It seemed he was a person who would not become ashamed of himself until he was forced to, or told to by someone. You couldn't set an example for him to follow, because he wouldn't follow it. He had to be shocked into it. So I guess I thought, it's my turn, not only to show him what he is, tell him what he is, just as my own personal dignity demands. I've been affronted, I thought, and I have a right to explode and carry on have a tantrum and tell him all those things. After all, was I always going to be the one who would be expected to take it on the chin? Not that I thought this in itself was unadmirable. Of course, everyone always talked like it was. Still, when people got to thinking of you in that way, good old so-and-so, let them take it because they can. You got to be some sort of a machine whose only virtue, really, only claim to fame was all the hardships you could bear. And it began to seem to me as though there were people like John, who, as long as you would take it, would keep pouring it out. Well, this didn't sound very much like Madame Butterfly. Of sorrow, bearing deep pain, and taking the brunt of it yourself. And when it became so unbearable for Madame Butterfly, she killed herself, but never reprimanded him or the other woman. Well, it doesn't sound much like that sort of a outlook on life, romanticizing Madame Butterfly. But this was one of the swings of the pendulum, you might say. And this thought, although I don't know how consciously I thought of it, I know that in the same manner that I saw things in my mind's eye, I saw myself going there, and maybe I even thought through some of the things I would say, and how I would stampede and stamp and throw a good one. And I wouldn't be held back this time by anything, and I'd make him hear what he was. If he could hand out so much, and there was no way, since I had trusted him, that I could avoid being the recipient of it, at least I wasn't going to take it sitting down. I wasn't going to take it without a squeak. He'd hear from me all right. Well, now, as strange and contradictory as it seems, I also had flashes of thoughts in my mind of going back and looking my best. Oh, I planned to look my best, regardless of what happened or which manner I was going to take. And I imagined knocking at the door and maybe standing there, maybe without words, maybe with a low, meaningful, "Hello, John." It would be sort of like when we were back together after breaking up that spring of '56. And I wouldn't say anything, wouldn't accuse him. Well, I don't think I even had in mind to say a word about how his new affair was going. Just sort of walk around the room there. Maybe there would be sort of a melancholy sadness in my eyes, and yet a meaningful look, and yes, a look that said, if you're ready to come back, if you still care, if you see that it meant something to you after all, you know how I feel. Maybe he would come back, and then it would all be very beautiful, and everything would be all right again, and it would be a wonderful world again. And then there was the aspect that he hadn't seen me since I'd lost weight. And there must have been something attractive about me, I thought. It seemed almost as though a new world had opened up for me. Whether it was in me or what, I seemed to be so much more attractive to men than I had been before. I don't remember what pair of shoes I had on, but it seems to me that they were higher heels than I had been wearing, although maybe I had worn them with my red dress. I had on a yellow, long-waist dress. Seems to me that Yvonne didn't like it for some reason, and she gave it to me, and now I was thin enough to wear it. And I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to appreciate this loss of weight and the new me. And this brings on another thought, another motive or way of acting that I had in mind. And that was to dash in, every bit the exciting, vibrant person I had been at the dance, at the picnic that night. Come in airily, to be breezy, not asking a thing of him, not in any way indicating that I wanted him to come back or expected he would come back at any rate. Come in asking him about how things were with him, maybe even airily, casually asking him about his love life, and talking about what I was doing, and sounding like a very exciting, interesting person. And yet, of course, I told myself this wasn't in the hope to win him back at all. Really don't know what I had in mind. I guess it was just that I wanted to see him. Maybe part of it was to see that trophy shelf, maybe just to see how he would act. And yet, caring what he thought of me, and wanting to create some sort of an impression on him, not just go as a disembodied spirit, observing, or even if I had, realizing that he would be aware of me and have some sort of an impression of me, and so this was the type of impression I hoped to create. One of the impressions that I thought of. Of course, the others were more with motives in mind. The last was more simply to see him and thinking of the best way for myself to act. Well, I didn't know what way I would act when I actually saw him. All these thoughts of how it might be were in my mind, and I had thought that I'd like to see him and tell him just what I thought of him, the kind of person he was, had shown himself to be, to make him listen, but rather to do that, rather simply to see him, rather to hope that he'd come back, or simply to taunt him and tease him. Still, as an outsider, I didn't know how I would act, but I did intend to go to his door. And maybe I realized that I wouldn't know until he opened it, after my knock. And maybe I had in mind not to answer as I had that day I'd gone up while Mama was waiting, if he called instead of opening the door, but simply to knock again. And I didn't know what attitude I would take once the door was opened and we were face to face. I suppose I expected to have all sorts of thoughts as I walked up the stairway, walked even toward the house, but I don't think I really expected to know how I would react. Well, at any rate, I had in mind to stay at Jay and Jean's, but they were strange about it. Very strange. Jean had been sick, she said. She'd had the flu, and that was told for some reason or other, maybe to explain that I couldn't have her bed, or maybe just simply to try to scare me out, it seemed. And I'd said, well, she's over it now, isn't she? Well, yes, said Jay, but she needs her sleep, and we can't have you coming in real late at night and waking us up. Or maybe it was Jean that said that. But I wouldn't be waking you up, I'd said. You could give me the key, and I'd just come in and sleep on the couch here. I wouldn't expect you to give me your bed, just let me sleep on the couch. That wouldn't bother you, would it? They had acted so very strange about it, and maybe Jay or Jean actually said, well, if you were coming to visit us, it would be different, but you're not here to see us. You're going out to the city with Dawn. You're not even going to spend the time with us. And maybe some way got in the idea that I was using the place for a hotel. It's just like this was a hotel or something. Maybe one of them even said, this isn't a hotel. It was done more as though they were telling me how to act, laying down expectations of how people should behave, not exactly in a catty way. Still, it just struck me so strange. I don't know if I'd already told them about my intention to go down the next day to see John. In fact, it seems to me that that's how the conversation had begun. I'd said that Dawn and I were going to the city, but I wondered if it would be all right if I stayed with them that night, because the next day I'd like to go down and see John while I'm here, before I go home, as I got to come down. And I think their answer had been a surprising, well, can't you stay in a hotel? This certainly did strike me a strange way to treat a friend. And I think I'd told them that my father objected to me coming down with a boy and staying at a hotel. If I didn't stay with friends, he'd want me to come home. And of course I'd hoped to stay over here because I hoped to see John the next day, and that would be difficult if I stayed at Elaine's in San Francisco. The next day must have been a Saturday, or else since school was out I inferred that John would be there all day, or that there would be some part of the day when I could see him. And then it seems to me that Jay or Jean said, well, Jean's had the flu, you know. Well, yes, but she's over it now, isn't she? Well, yes, but we can't have you coming in at 1 or 2 o'clock. Jean needs her sleep. She's been sick. This struck me strange. After all, I wouldn't come in and wake them up. Or maybe it was said to first to show me that Jean couldn't give up her bed. I'd just come in and unlock the door. You could give me the key, and I'd just come in and lay down on the couch here. Well, they had just sounded so cold about it, almost as if, well, if I wanted to see John, why couldn't I come down and stay at a hotel some other time when I hadn't come with Dawn or a young man? I don't remember whether Dawn was present. I'm sure that he wasn't, or I wouldn't have talked about my father not wanting me to stay in a hotel because of him being there. And there was just no way of getting out of it, although I don't think I said that to them, because if I did go to a hotel and Dawn went on home, my father still hadn't liked that idea. The only way was to stay with the girls, and they were not at all hospitable. Oh, I don't think I'd bother you very much if I just came in and slept on your couch here. Would that bother you? You wouldn't even need to wake up. Well, you're going over to the city with Dawn. And this was said with a rebuffing sound, as though to tell me that I was very unreasonable. You didn't really come to see us. Day was in on it as much as Jean, these remarks. Yes, it would seem almost like you just were using this for a hotel. I don't know whether the invitation was finally conceded to. It certainly wasn't extended, I don't believe you could say. But finally they may have given in. Well, all right, if you want to. But don't come in late. It certainly wasn't a warm invitation. And I took it all with sort of the bewilderment